perfections of Hyde's character, recalled the tragedies of her youth, and praised her role as an instructress. In the poem, Frances evoked her sense of having lost a soulmate who understood her own strivings and aspirations. A former neighbor of Nancy Hyde's actually wrote a letter to Frances, which is in the London County Historical Society, in which he encouraged Frances to keep writing because he said her skill had made Nancy Hyde bloom again. Sigourney, Huntley Sigourney, became an important role model for Frances in showing that a woman could still be womanly, could be a wife, could be a mother, but could be an author as well. Caulkins in the 1850s wrote a short sketch for Boston Weekly Magazine in which she said about Sigourney, Sigourney's life rebuts the popular but stale notion that female writers are of course negligent in personal costume, domestic thrift, and all the social offices which are a woman's appropriate and beautiful sphere of action. So Frances had in front of her someone who had stayed within the domestic sphere because Lydia Huntley Sigourney married and had children, but who was a writer. Now, Caulkins might at 16, 17 want her to become a writer. She could not. Family circumstances meant she had to go to work to support her family. Her stepfather had died. Her mother had 3 children by the second marriage. Her older sister, Pamela, I'm not quite sure what was going on with Pamela because Pamela would go out and work as a school teacher and come home. Pamela would go out and work as a housekeeper and come home. Pamela would go out and live with a relative and come home. It's through her entire life. She lived into her 90s. But Frances, with her scanty education, I mean, she herself said fewer than 12 months total in a formal educational setting, decided to open a young ladies' academy in Norwich Town, in the Haven house. When her stepfather died, he died without a will. So dying intestate, it left the house basically in trust for his 2 sons of the second marriage till they reached 21, and it gave Fanny Haven a life interest in the house, so Fanny could stay there. So Frances used the family house, which wasn't very large, to open Miss Caulkins School. She ran it from 1820 to 1829. In the mold of Huntley and Hyde, she taught serious subjects to her students: French, history, geography, arithmetic, calculus, astronomy, morals, and letter writing. She encouraged the girls to write in private journals. She actually had the girls create their own newspaper called the Scholars Repository. There are 5 issues of it in the London County Historical Society. When I first saw one, these girls printed so beautifully, I thought it was offset printed. It's an amazing 4 to 6 pages. It included students' poems, pieces of fiction, essays on friendship, on contentment, on the studies most necessary for females. One of the articles, echoing Frances's precepts, wrote, "No study can be more useful for young females than history. It strengthens the memory and enlarges the mind." I tell my students that at UConn. Caulkins herself wrote on each of the 5 copies the personal goals for the school. So this is a Caulkins poem. Ah, happy girls on Thames' verdant plains, you taste the joy of life without its pains. Studious alike, to learn whate'er may tend to raise the genius or the heart to mend, each realm of science or taste to explore, and with the ancient blend the modern war. Frances gained some autonomy, living in her mom's house, but with her older sister and the younger siblings there to do the household chores. She was relatively independent. She did not have to give up her independence to become a wife and a mother. And most wives and mothers gave up any independent existence. Alexis de Tocqueville, in touring the United States in the 1830s, wrote about young women. And he wrote this: in America, the independence of women is irrevocably lost in the bonds of matrimony. By remaining unmarried, Caulkins retained freedom of action. She acquired many books, 300 of them in the London County Historical Society. And she wrote her signature across the book. She wrote the date she acquired it. She wrote where she acquired it from. It's an amazing collection of books. She cataloged and collected an extensive array of native plants, meticulously writing out their scientific names. She began an extensive series of genealogies, starting first with her mother's and father's families, but eventually expanded it to 25 handwritten books of genealogies of the families of New London County. They are still in the New London County Historical Society. She visited and recorded the inscription on nearly every gravestone in every graveyard in New London and Norwich. And as an observer of ordinary people, she kept a journal in which she noted her conversations with elderly people in the community. Now that one I've seen. So she knew Mother Bailey. She would interview centenarians and people who made their 100th birthday on the date of their birthday. Do a little thumbnail sketch of what they looked like or what their facilities or faculties were, and then give a mini history. Now one area of Frances' life, so far as I can find, was unfulfilled. During her teaching career in Norwich, in New London, even in the rest of her life, there is no record that Frances had any relationship with men. When she opened her school in 1820, she, at age 25, was still of marriageable age, but she did not marry. Why? Well, one, at that point she was the sole support of her mother and her half-siblings and Pamela. Again, I'm not ever sure about Pamela. So she probably assumed no man was willing to marry her and assume her burdens, because she certainly would not have married and abandoned her family responsibility. I think a more likely reason is that as she increasingly educated herself, as she increasingly became a genteel young woman, she found few men in Norwich and New London who could match her learning or her gentility. Her desire for self-improvement, a desire that her half-brother later wrote, was so ardent a thirst for knowledge as to amount to an almost insatiable craving, probably discouraged prospective suitors. Okay? Even if Frances had found a possible husband, marriage in the 1820s would have meant an end to her life as an author, as a researcher, as a teacher. Now, Hawkins really enjoyed teaching her school. I have tons of letters. I don't remember what my next PowerPoint is. This is Hawkins as a young woman. I had seen an etching of this picture. It was put in the reissue of her History of Norwich, which came out in 1866. But I presented a talk at the Norwich Faith Trumbull DAR, and hanging on the wall in the back parlor is the original of this painting. Now, the then regent of the DAR assured me when I get the book done I can put a picture in the book, but this is a picture of Frances, probably around age 30 to 35. However, her school was not a success. She kept lists of the number of students she had. They came from prominent families in Norwich, the Huntingtons, the Lathrops, but she never had more than 15 to 19 students. And I have records of what she charged them. Okay? She's like the IPO for Lyft. Never made a profit. Okay? Her half-brother Henry later wrote, the family was so poor, he himself attended the local schools for only a few months. Frances educated him. So, as a result of the lack of financial security, the continued need to support her family, and the fact that some of the wealthiest men in Norwich had opened the Norwich Young Ladies Academy up on Jail Hill, Bean Hill, Hawkins in 1829 made a career move. The trustees of a Young Ladies Academy in New London hired her to become the director. She moved to New London, relocating her half-siblings, her elder sister Pamela, again I'm like, I don't know what Pamela's doing, to New London. She taught there for 3 years. And then the male trustees of the Norwich Young Ladies Academy contacted her and asked her to move back to Norwich and run their school. She accepted the position in 1832. Under her leadership, the school was quite successful, expanding to an enrollment of 90 students by 1833. In her History of Norwich, she wrote that they had boarders from 15 states in those 90 students. That was success. when you look at the picture of the building, okay, I'll go back to this in a minute. I don't even know how she fit 15 people in there. This house still stands up Broadway, up Beam Hill or Jail Hill. So 1833, the school was a success. In her history of Norwich, she does not mention she, the author of the history, was the head of this school. She wrote, the school closed in 1834 because of its inconvenient location on the steep hills of Norwich, making it hard to attract enough students to stay in operation. All right, that's not the explanation. What was going on in Norwich in 1834 and in neighboring Canterbury? Prudence Crandall. Okay? Several new influences had entered Hawkins' life in the previous 3 years. For years, even though she always attended church, she had questioned her faith, she'd questioned her worthiness, and had hesitated to join a church because she was unsure of her godliness. But while in New London in 1831, she made a profession of faith and joined the First Congregational Church of New London. And she made a public confession of faith to the church, saying she was emerging from a deep sense of sin and a demanding need for Christ. Being a member of the church led Hawkins to become involved in the First Congregational Church's Sunday school, especially teaching the illiterate in New London about religion. When she came back to Norwich in 1832, her interest in the Sunday school movement was of particular importance. She attended the Second Congregational Church down the hill from the school. The Second Congregational Church was the same church attended by the Harris sisters. And they were attending the church at the time Frances was there. This is why I love doing history presentations, because I have no documents that the students in the classes Frances taught were the Harris sisters. I have no documents that the Harris sisters personally knew Frances, but they were both members of the same church. Sunday schools in Norwich, as the Freedom Trail says, had long served the needs of the African American community, providing basic literacy education along with religion. Early as 1815, Congregational churches in Norwich recorded offering Sunday school classes to African Americans. 41 African Americans were listed in the Sunday schools in 1817, and by the 1830s, the Sunday schools apparently had dozens of African Americans who were getting their basic education in the Sunday schools because the Norwich public schools were not open to blacks. It seems likely that when Frances taught Sunday school at the Second Congregational Church, she at least knew the Harris sisters. So again, I get to speculate. I can't publish this yet. But is it fair to consider whether or not Sarah Harris, who had that same incredible thirst for education, because she wanted to make a difference in the lives of African Americans, that she approached Hawkins about standing in the back of the classroom at the Norwich Young Ladies Academy to listen to the lessons? Now, Hawkins certainly supported African Americans. She wrote empathetically and feelingly about them, but Hawkins did not own this school. The male board of trustees ran the school. So I'm sure Hawkins said, I can't do that. But, all right, would Frances have said to Sarah Harris, Prudence Crandall over in Canterbury has opened a new school for young ladies. It is her own school. And the Harris families, I can't remember if it was Sarah's father, they had a farm and tannery in Glasgow, part of Canterbury. So the Harrises would have been going back and forth to their father's house anyway. So Hawkins might have suggested to Sarah that she go to Prudence Crandall and ask if she stand in the back of the room. But here's another speculation. By 1832, Frances Hawkins had been teaching young ladies this more advanced education for 12 years. She'd actually taught before that in village schools. She taught in a school her uncle let her open in the house on Manwaring Hill. She'd actually started as a teacher at age 14. Prudence Crandall was coming straight from her school in Newport, had never run a school before. People, what are the chances? It's 15 miles. That Prudence didn't contact Frances and say, what do you do about bills? What do you feed them? How do they sleep? Do they share beds? What books do you use? I don't know if that happened. But for Prudence trying to open a successful school, it makes sense to me that she would have contacted the person with the most experience in what it took to open a school. Now, by 1834, Frances was not only involved with African Americans, she knew about the uproar that was taking place in Canterbury. When the parents pulled their girls out of the school, Prudence contacted William Lloyd Garrison, and Garrison encouraged her to shut the school and open it as a school for black girls. And the school had reopened. There was tremendous hostility from the neighborhood. The Connecticut legislature passed the black law, which made it a crime to educate black girls from outside the state of Connecticut, so that Prudence could not bring boarders in from outside the state. Hawkins was aware of the uproar in Canterbury. She actually wrote to a friend in 1834 that a picture of, quote, our Miss Crandall, and that's what she wrote in the letter, was on display in Boston, prominently with a painting of William Wilberforce, one of the leading abolitionists and Quakers from England. So these are going on in 1834. Hawkins never published a personal explanation of why the school closed. She said it closed because it was on a high hill. But she was more than an active supporter of anti-slavery. She had become an advocate of abolition. As I said earlier, if I can go back. Okay. She was the person who founded the Norwich Female Anti-Slavery Society. She had a confirmation from William Lloyd Garrison that he gave her the permission or the charter to open this anti-slavery society. Okay, tensions in Norwich were high because Prudence Crandall's trial for the crime of educating black girls was coming up in July. All right? Now, Hawkins was president of the Norwich Anti-Slavery Society. She had taught African Americans. Perhaps because of that experience, she went farther with her agitation on the anti-slavery issue. She wrote and published this poem. All right? Hark the chain, the clanking chain with our triumph blending, signs of sorrow, groans of pain, or our songs ascending. Till the slaves with lifted hands, mid his anguish raving, on his neck proud freedom stands, all her banners waving. She was criticizing the Norwich citizens for celebrating the 4th of July when people were enslaved. In another stanza, she actually criticizes Norwich for using slave-grown cotton for the industrial success of the Norwich manufacturing. She hath cut oppression's cord. She rebukes each haughty lord. With her foot's contemptuous thrust, tramples millions to the dust. Still our injured brother man must endure the scourge, the ban. He must still a bondman be. He, proud freedom, will not free. And in the final stanza, Hawkins calls not just for anti-slavery. She calls for immediate abolition. Immediate abolition was far more explosive, far more radical than passive opposition to slavery that many people espoused in the North. Again, I'm this close. I have no direct evidence that the publication or reading of Frances's poem was related to it. But on July 4th, there was a meeting of the Norwich Anti-Slavery Society in the Second Congregational Church. This is a pamphlet. If you can't read from the back, it says a sermon preached at Second Congregational Church, Norwich, on the 4th of July, 1834. at the request of the Anti-Slavery Society of Norwich and vicinity by James Dickinson, pastor of the Second Congregational Church. Norwich, published by the Anti-Slavery Society, 1834. About the time that Frances published her poem, there was an anti-slavery meeting in the Second Congregational Church. Well, throughout New England, when people were advocating anti-slavery and abolition, industrialists were hiring their workers to create anti-abolition mobs to break up the meetings. Abby Kelly, a Quaker from Worcester, faced men coming into a church in Torrington, shooting out the candles and threatening to shoot anyone in the church. What happened here in Norwich is the anti-abolition mob entered the church, took the minister out, took the speaker out, put him on a rail, and ran him out of the town. The minister was fired. Now, in a reissue of the History of Norwich, Frances didn't put it in the first issue in 1846, but when she republished in 1866, she added this little caustic note. The town of Norwich issued an ordinance in 1837 that said, resolved, that it is the duty of every good citizen to discountenance seditious and incendiary doctrines of every sort. We deny entirely the use of the town hall or any other building owned by the town for any purpose whatsoever connected with the abolition of slavery. Again, Hawkins, in describing why the school closed, did not mention her personal involvement with anti-slavery as a reason for closing the school. But her public support of abolition, her publishing, this wasn't a handwritten poem, this is printed on newspaper printing, but she cut it out and pasted it in her notebook. So I don't know what paper she printed it in. But her public stance against slavery could have elicited the same response from the parents of the girls in the Norwich Young Ladies Academy, causing them to withdraw their daughters from the school. Conversely, the white, male, wealthy trustees of the Norwich Young Ladies Academy, skewered by that poem, might have closed the school rather than have the controversy of firing a popular and successful director. In fact, they opened a Norwich school for boys and girls 2 years later. Many of the same trustees who were trustees of the Young Ladies Academy were involved in opening another academy a couple years later. Frances, although, also wrote how she was terrified of violence, and the violence of the anti-slavery mob might have so intimidated her that she basically quit at the school, and the school closed temporarily because it didn't have a head. But any of these reasons could have convinced her to abandon teaching. Frances wrote to a friend in New York in August of 1834. Here I am, as the sailors say, lying upon my oars, not knowing where the storms of life will drift me next, and beginning to look about with anxious forecast for some friendly haven where I can moor my little bark in safety. In other words, after a few months of agreeable relaxation, I was warned by some admonitory symptoms connected with my funds that I must make preparation to bind on again my iron belt in the spring. Do not be surprised to hear me talk thus of school keeping, but remember, I have borne the yoke as cheerfully as I could for many years, and I now have most longing desire to keep my neck out of it. Now, there's evidence when she was living in New York, she did occasionally take a school for a term, but she pretty much never taught again as her career. She moved to New York City in 1836, taking up residence with the Nevins family. One of her mother's sisters had married Henry Nevins, and that woman had died. So Frances may have gone to New York to provide kind of like housekeeper / governess chores for her uncle, to help raise those young cousins. But I think there's a more important reason. And I wasn't able to get in and get a copy. Frances had been given a membership in the American Tract Society, which is run by what has now become the Baptist Church. The American Tract Society membership was $20, and she was notified by the Tract Society that an anonymous friend had paid for the membership. Well, I think Lydia Sigourney was probably that anonymous friend, because Lydia Sigourney by 1832 had published several different pieces in the American Tract Society. But another possible connection is, I mentioned the Lathrops were students in Frances's Academy from 1820 to 1829. The secretary of the American Tract Society, located in New York City, was William Halleck, married to a Norwich woman, Fanny Lathrop. Now, there was a Fanny Lathrop listed on Frances's annual list of students. And again, I don't know for sure it's the same Fanny Lathrop, but that might have been the connection that took her to New York. As soon as she became a member, she entered an essay in the American Tract Society's contest for new tracts. Her essay, The Sabbath Duties of Parents and Guardians, not only won the first prize of $50, the Society published it under the title, Do Your Children Reverence the Sabbath? The possibility of being able to fulfill family responsibilities with the more attractive possibility of being able to make money writing, something that she had wanted to do forever, could have been reason enough to move to New York City. For the next 6 years, her success was extraordinary. She lived with her cousins, she traveled to Niagara Falls, she traveled to somewhere in Michigan, because she's writing these letters all over the place to people in Norwich. She became one of the most prolific writers for the Tract Society. The Society printed over 1 million copies of her second tract, a pious piece she called Pequot of 100 Years. It's a 4-page tract. It stressed the abiding power of faith and the depth of Christian experience as it chronicled the life of a Pequot centenarian. Now, one of the things I told you is Frances was out there talking to people. She talked to every single native speaker of Pequot and Mohegan she could locate. And then she would write to somebody, oh, I talked to so-and-so, but I haven't learned any new words. I talked to so-and-so. His daughter speaks some English. He only speaks Pequot. So in her interviewing people from the local tribes, she had learned about this Pequot centenarian who had become a Christian. In 1841, the Society published a book of Hawkins' religious poems, Children of the Bible. Many of her tracts had publication runs of several 100,000 and were translated into as many as 8 to 10 different languages. Because the Cole Porters, the missionaries who went out, they needed the tracts in the languages of the people they were trying to convert. She had leisure and apparently some wealth because she was able to read German by paying a German to teach her while she was living in New York. She became acquainted with Signor Mariangeli, an Italian political exile who taught her Italian, and Frances bought her own copy of Dante in the Italian. It's in the Maloney County Historical Society. I think it's been opened twice. Once by Frances and once by me. And how books are like brand new, has gilding on the edges of the pages. It's barely been touched. She moved back, however, to New London in 1842 to live with her brother, half-brother Henry Haven. Henry Haven, the young man who said he got fewer than a couple months of formal education, had become an office boy for William W. Williams, who was the wealthiest whaler in New London at the beginning of the whaling period. By 1842, Henry was a partner with Williams, and they had a firm, Williams and Haven. He was in the process of building a beautiful mansion up on Hempstead Street near the intersection with Broad. And Frances came home the day that they finished plastering the ceiling, and she mentioned in a letter back to someone in New York that the ceiling fell down. So plasterers had trouble then as well. Her mother was getting older, and her brother had recently married a member of the Douglas family. And Frances had advocated for her niece, Anna Haven, to attend, her half-sister, Elizabeth Haven, to attend the new Mount Holyoke Academy for Girls. And Elizabeth met Elizabeth Douglas at Mount Holyoke. I have letters from Frances to Mount Holyoke about the living and how they went to school, class for 2 hours a day, so it wasn't too tough on the young women. Okay? And how much it cost. And Frances even talked about going up Mount Holyoke and collecting flowers when she was on a trip to see her niece at Mount Holyoke. But Henry had married Elizabeth Douglas, and by 1842 they had children. So Frances was back living with her brother. I think the most important reason she moved back to Connecticut is she was ready. This is maybe a little bit after she wrote in that autobiography, to finally do something with all that information she had gathered as a young woman. She came back in 1842, and in 1845 she self-published her history of Norwich, Connecticut, from its possession by the Indians to the year 1845. Her goal, she said, was to preserve the records of local history. That, this is a quote, would be lost if left much longer in the charge of moldering paper, fading ink, and fast-dropping age. It was more than a history of the great white men of the community. It was more than a sentimental history of the good old days. She cited formal documents, town records, tax records, legal records, newspapers, but she also used oral histories. And one of the types of books she bought throughout her life were other local histories, most of which said, no, 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 we don't talk to people. And Frances literally said she did use as sources tradition and conversation with aged persons. Tradition, she said, is an uncertain guide, a glimmering light that often leads astray, for it rests wholly on memory, and memory is frequently treacherous. An officious imagination often gets lodged in its place. I know that happens to me. But when tradition contradicts no written record, and when the records fail, even such history may be used to aid history. And she said, references would be useless. This book is not a compilation of previous published documents. It's not based on published histories. It has no predecessor. It cannot appeal to works which are generally accessible. And it was an entirely new kind of history. It was probably the first social history written in New England. I haven't looked at the books written in the rest of the country, but it was the history of ordinary people arising in part from looking at church records, looking at marriage records, looking at size of family, looking at the interval between children, looking at her genealogies. She brought in stories of women when they were relevant to her narrative. She narrated some of the romantic Indian legends and stories from the past. She narrated the history of people from all levels of society, rather than limiting her history to the rich, white men, leaders of the community. And she told her stories of ordinary people with a dry sense of humor that still makes her book very readable. The book was a success. By 1846, Hawkins was tapping into a growing reverence for early history. Norwich had become increasingly commercial. Residents were very interested in their past. But she didn't just sell it to people in Norwich. She was an inveterate self-promoter. She sent copies of her book to every historical society in the Northeast that was in existence in 1845, including to the Massachusetts Historical Society. Almost immediately, the members of the Mass Historical Society inundated her, and I'm serious, with letters. Well, what did Franklin say about this? Where was so-and-so in Norwich about that? What newspaper published the first anti-slavery statement in 1776? And she answered every single one. She fulfilled these requests, men who were asking her for research. James Savage published a book in which he gave her no credit for the information provided. I can see she provided the information, it's in his book, no footnote. George Bancroft wrote a U.S. history, wrote her to ask her about Benjamin Franklin. Bancroft used it, no footnote. Okay? But in 1849, somebody in the Historical Society, Mass Historical Society, wrote the following: "There is nothing I would not do to get into the good lady's good graces." This was a minister out on Cape Cod who was interested in an early minister in New London. And Frances had somehow come into possession of this minister's sermons. And so the minister out on Cape Cod is the one who said, "There's nothing I would not do to get into the good lady's good graces." And so a couple months later, the male board of the Massachusetts Historical Society elected her as a corresponding member. As I said earlier, the first woman so elected, and the only woman elected until 1966. 1966. 1849 to 1966. They were pretty backward. In 1852, she compiled her second history, the history of New London, from the first survey of the coast to 1852. By this time, she'd gained confidence as a writer. She also remembered to have an index. She wrote to Sylvester Judd, who was a historian of Northampton, Massachusetts, "Your criticism of the lack of index is shared by me. I often can't find in the book what I know I wrote." Okay? And that first book was only about 300 pages long. In the introduction to the New London history, she said the book was an outgrowth of her veneration of her ancestors. But she had a more sophisticated motivation as well. She had lessons for current citizens. She talked about the lessons of history, that it provided counsels and warnings for the future. Her main object, she said in her introduction, was to illustrate the gradual progress of society. This ties her in with a group of historians known as Whig historians, who were writing in the 1840s and 1850s, looking for lessons on how America could be greater by learning from its past. This was a family history of New London, illustrating their success in the face of adversity. She narrated the attacks on the Pequot village, and she got a copy of the Lyon Gardner map of the Narragansetts and the Mohegans outside the village, and the English standing there like little soldier figures shooting in. She decried the savagery of the battle. She provided stories of the foundings of the churches, talked about the disruptive Rogerines, but assigned blame on both sides. Nobody who wrote about the Rogerines up to 1853 ever said that John Rogers had a foot to stand on. She traced the actions of the heroes and villains at the Battle of Fort Trumbull and Fort Griswold, but she brought a personal touch. She narrated personal recollections of people who'd seen Lafayette or Washington riding by, or how people saved their homes from Benedict Arnold. There's one I love. There had been some British prisoners of war in New London in the late 1770s, and they had stayed with New London people. And they'd kind of gotten to know who were the Tories and who weren't. And they came back with the invading troops in September of 1781. And they ran ahead of the troops, and they went to the houses of the British sympathizers and told them to put an X on their door. Put an X on the door. Put an X on the door. And we won't burn your house down. And somebody watching this happen went out and put X's on all the doors on like 3 streets. Okay? But that's in there. No white rich guy would have written that in a history book in 1853. Whenever possible, okay, she noted the accomplishments of New London's